The Ottoman Empire has grappled with the modernization question for centuries preceding its collapse. Before World War I, modernization efforts sought to reaffirm Islamic justice, centralize law, and stave off Ottoman decline. The 1839 Edict of Gulhana is indicative of these efforts, kickstarting the Tanzimat era of the late empire. It sought to modernize the empire within tradition, referring to justice, security of life and property, and rule of law. And although the edict set a reformist tone and laid the groundwork for later Tanzimat reforms, it ultimately fell short of achieving everything it set out for, being weakly enforced and failing to prevent further Ottoman decline. The Edict of Gulhana isn't just indicative of one contentious policy, but rather a symptom of the empire's overall approach to reform. A step in the right direction, but too rooted in the past, too scared of backlash, and lacking a true revolutionary spirit. Throughout the empire's lifespan, it tiptoed rather than sprinted into modernization efforts, and by the late 1800s had fallen behind its more developed neighbors, being deemed the sick man of Europe. Despite all of the Ottomans' efforts to keep up whilst preserving their legacy, they ultimately fell further into decline, culminating in the empire's fall in World War I. The 1923 Republic, which replaced the empire, did not face these issues. Secularist reforms sought to sever Turkey from its past as much as possible. Western-influenced urban planning, such as that done by French designer Henri Prost, imposed Cartesian grids onto the winding roads of Istanbul, and the switch from an Arabic to Latin script divorced Turkey from even its original language. The Republic didn't just turn a blind eye to Ottoman history, but sought specifically to separate it from modern Turkey. One striking example of this historical rewriting was the systematic destruction of Ottoman cemeteries. Cemeteries throughout Istanbul and Turkey, especially Armenian cemeteries, were demolished in urban development plans, with some reports of gravestones being used as makeshift staircases in construction. Taksim Square, a major leisure and tourist district, had its historical buildings demolished and a new Republican monument erected in their stead. This was not just urban planning, it was memory removal. Unlike more moderate reforms of the Tanzimat era, Republican reforms preserved as little as possible, culturally and spatially, from its Ottoman roots. While majorly successful in modernizing Turkey, the Republic's more radical approach faced issues of its own. The Ottoman legacy could not so simply be erased. Throughout centuries, it was baked into architecture, culture, arts, religion, and Turkish identity, and the Republic's attempts to re-narrativize Turkish history and identity could ultimately only go halfway, as remnants of Ottoman culture remained present all throughout Turkey. Istanbul is a microcosm of this phenomenon, existing as a palimpsest, partially erased and rebuilt but still carrying the baggage of its past. Istanbul had faced radical redefinition throughout the 20th century. The 1950s and 60s saw massive rural to urban migration in Turkey, greatly expanding the city and leading to unplanned Gecekondu settlements. Photos from the 1950s show Gecekondu settlements creeping up Istanbul's hillsides, literalizing the collapse of spatial planning. By the 1970s, Istanbul was so greatly polarized politically and culturally that assassinations and bombings became an everyday occurrence. This version of Istanbul was undergoing an identity crisis, stratified, ideologically torn, and split between new and old, east and west. The city was no longer governed by a coherent historical narrative. It became a contested space of stories, myths, and ideological residues. Orhan Pamuk, who became an author in the midst of 1970s Istanbul, sought to address this cultural rewriting in his novel The Black Book. After decades of historical rewriting and spatial erasure, The Black Book doesn't attempt to reconstruct the past. It questions whether such a thing is even possible. As Istanbul becomes unmoored from any coherent narrative, Pamuk offers a historiographical response, not by restoring the archive, but by replacing it with narrative. Pamuk devotes particular attention to the stories embedded in objects, and to how objects themselves are shaped by the stories told about them. This constructed, informal archive emerges early in the Black Book through Aladdin's shop, which mirrors the real-world clutter of Istanbul's neighborhood corner stores, spaces where memory is perspectivized and the storekeeper and customer redefine an object's history through their observation and narration. This recursive narrative structure between archive and author forms the backbone for the Black Book's deconstruction of Istanbul and of identity. Galip's physical journey through the city mirrors this narrative recursion. As he wanders through modern districts and forgotten alleyways, he doesn't move forward so much as circle through layers of overwritten memory. One of the most potent visual parallels to this structure is the Mannequin Shop, once renowned for its accurate depiction of Istanbulites but now relegated underground by Republican reforms. Drawing from post-1950s display window culture, the Mannequin Shop serves not just as a representation of historical erasure, but an archive that has failed to be narrativized, now lying physically buried and metaphorically divorced from the clean, coherent Istanbul story being told above. It is only when Galip, a stand-in for the reader, listens to the shopkeeper's stories that the mannequins are embedded into the physical space and history of Istanbul. As Ghalib continues his journey and continues writing in Jalal's columns, he physically becomes Jalal, demonstrating the power of writing to modify both identity and history. In becoming Jalal, Ghalib does not recover a fixed identity or stable past. He enacts the very impossibility of doing so. Pamuk's The Black Book ultimately suggests that neither the Tanzimat's cautious reforms nor the Republic's radical ruptures could offer a coherent resolution to the modernization question. Both projects, though diametrically opposed in strategy, fell into the same paradox: the attempt to control history by narrating over it. But Pamuk posits that history resists such closure. In Istanbul, identity lingers in ruins, mannequins, alleyways, and recycled columns, not as a linear archive but as a palimpsest of memory and forgetting. Through Ghalib's recursive journey, Pamuk offers not a history of Istanbul, but a historiography, one that embraces ambiguity, resists authoritarian authorship, and accepts that modernity is not something inherited or imposed, but endlessly rewritten in the act of storytelling itself. Ultimately, Pamuk demonstrates that it is the manner with which we tell stories that decides the history and identity of those stories. His historiographical response denounces a single coherent through line and embraces the many versions of Istanbul all contradicting each other, haunting streets and objects, and being given life by narrative.